Baseball season's underway. Well, you better get ready for a brand new day. Hey, Chicago, what do you say? The Cubs are gonna win today. They're singing, go Cubs, go! Go Cubs, go! Hey, Chicago, what do you say? The Cubs are gonna win today. Go Cubs, go! Go Cubs, go! Hey, Chicago, what do you say? The Cubs are gonna win today. They got the power, they got the speed to be the best in the National League. Well, this is the year and the Cubs are real. So come on down to Wrigley Field. We're singing now, go Cubs, go! Go Cubs, go! Hey, Chicago, what do you say? The Cubs are gonna win today. Go Cubs, go! Go Cubs, go! Hey, Chicago, what do you say? The Cubs are gonna win today.
Welcome to Good Seats Still Available, a curious little podcast devoted to exploring what used to be in professional sports. Here's your host, Tim Hanlon.
Good Lord, another episode. How are you, everybody? My name is Tim Hanlon, of course, and this is Good Seats Still Available. Thank you for coming back and finding us. It's our curious little podcast journey. We do it each and every week, despite all the odds against it, as our little investigation into what used to be in professional sports. And I know what you're saying. Why the hell did we have to listen to a minute and a half of Steve Goodman singing Go Cubs Go when the Cubs are still very much with us and you know, having won a championship a couple of years ago and competitive and, you know, Wrigley Field and, you know, Chicago loves them and all that kind of stuff. Well, you know, you're right, but we're not going to be talking about the Cubs of today. We're actually going to go way back into what, frankly, not your average Cub fan even knows. And that is what the Cubs used to be before 1903, when they became somewhat officially known as the Cubs for the first time. You may not know or may think you know, but really don't, that this team actually got its start way back in the earliest days of the National League and a tad bit earlier. But for all intents and purposes, the official professional history lineage began for the Cubs in 1876 when they were known as, stand back, the Chicago White Stockings. Yeah, you'd think that you'd know that by now, but yeah, the Chicago White Stockings, no, not the current Chicago White Sox. That's a different story for a different episode. The Chicago White Stockings of the National League was the first team in the progression that ultimately became the Chicago Cubs in 1903. And that is our conversation, those formative years when the Cubs, prior to 1903, were known as not only the White Stockings, but later the Chicago Colts for a good portion of the 1890s. And then the Chicago Orphans, and we'll get into the reasons why they were called that. And we'll also get into the origins as to how they got their name, mostly as a nickname to start, but then it's stuck, of the Cubs into the years preceding and then into 1903. And we get into all of that fun stuff with our guest this week, Jack Bales. And Jack has written the seminal book for any Cub fan. You consider yourself a Cub fan, you need this book to complete your understanding, your history, your knowledge, your postgraduate degree, if you will. And the book that Jack has literally just published, courtesy of our friends at McFarland, it's called Before They Were Cubs, the Early Years of Chicago's First Professional Baseball Team. And as always, I learn a ton. And I'm not necessarily the biggest Cub fan. Yeah, I know I live in Chicago. I married into it. So, don't yell at me. But as my in-laws and their family, my wife's family have rubbed off on me, I've learned and become quite the aficionado of the history and the legacy of this team. It predates the name of the Cubs. We get into all that stuff. And clearly this is a franchise that has many, many interesting and good and successful things ahead of it as Wrigley Field continues to get refurbished and the whole neighborhood gets revitalized around it. And hell, even its own regional sports network starting next year. So the Cubs, right, very full of legacy. And we're going to get into the earliest parts of that legacy with our guest, Jack Bales, coming up in just a couple of moments. We want to, of course, as always, thank one of our great sponsors. And this week, we spin the dial and it lands on, yes, 503 Sports. It's 503 Sports. We love 503 Sports. You find them at 503-sports.com. Don't forget that dash. What do you find there? Well, they fancy themselves as the king of throwbacks. And we love them especially, not because they've got just great, T-shirts and logos featuring a whole bunch of teams and leagues and sports that have come and gone, shall we say. But they also do amazing handcrafted replicas of some of the original uniforms of those teams of yore, which are certified for their authenticity from the makers at 503 Sports. And it is probably the best and maybe ultimate way to show your love and your fandom for a team or a league that broke your heart by coming and going, shall we say. Very much found in the realm of football. So if you want a USFL jersey, a WFL jersey, an XFL, the original version from 2001 jersey. How about the World League of American Football? Yeah, even the UFL from 2009 to 2012. Was it Omaha Nighthawks fans out there? There's a whole array of stuff from that realm of football at 503-sports.com. I'm scrolling here. I'll make sure I got the team name. Yes, the Omaha Nighthawks. There's even a replica helmet there, too, if you want that. But interestingly, and just recently, I just found out from our friend Dustin Alameda, who is the chief cook and bottle washer at 503 Sports, they just launched a replica jersey section for the ABA. Some great stuff. Yeah, they got T-shirts and all the great logos and stuff. But if you're looking for an Anaheim Amigos jersey, how about an Oakland Oaks jersey to celebrate our great conversation with Pat Boone that we had about a year and a half ago? Search that episode up and wear that while you're listening, why don't you? How about the New Jersey Americans, the predecessor to the New Jersey Nets, or maybe even the Washington Caps? Yes, the Caps of Washington, which had a checkered history. Miami Floridians, I mean, they're all there, not only in T-shirts, but in jersey form at 503 Sports. Again, you're going to find them at 503-sports.com. Oh, and by the way, we wouldn't leave you hanging. We got a promo code for you. My God, we've got a promo code for you, and it's for 10% off all of your purchases. That's the promo code SEATS, S-E-A-T-S. SEATS, that's the promo code at 503-sports.com. The king of throwbacks they are. 503 Sports, give them a try. Yeah, as they say, and I mean it this time. You'll be glad you did. All right, and you'll be glad you did stick around for this conversation. Even if you're not a Cub fan, I think you're going to find this interesting because it really gets into some of the early rumblings of how some of the teams that have lasted for so long in Major League Baseball, like the Cubs, kind of got their sea legs. It's a great chat we had just a couple of weeks back with our new pal, Jack Bales. Here it is. This little show, for whatever reason, has kind of decided to focus on what used to be. And those are teams and leagues no longer with us, either defunct or previously domiciled. And certainly, the story of the Cubs prior to them being the Cubs absolutely fits the genre. Now, it's a very historical. We also recognize, too, that, a lot of these stories are, some of them are more modern. But obviously, as the years pile on, they become sort of more historical digs, if you will. But, with teams that still exist like the Cubs today, right, this is absolutely part of the lore. And having lived in the Chicago area now for almost 20 years and my wife and her family being Cubs fans, the lore certainly goes very deep and is actually probably, unbeknownst to a whole generation of Cub fans that consider themselves such, right?
Yeah, absolutely. In fact, I'm from Aurora, Illinois myself, my hometown. And Chicago, is the only National League team from 1876 that is still playing in the city in which it was founded. So, yeah, there is an awful lot of lore there.
Well, so having grown up here then, and it's pretty clear from an outside purview that you somehow fell hard for the Cubs, perhaps growing up or when you lived here. Maybe you can give us a little sense of how the Cubs sort of hit your radar and when in your lifetime, and then maybe why a book such as this on this early era of the team.
Well, I grew up in Aurora, Illinois, and in fact, on my desk right now is a picture of me and my twin brother and our younger brother, about 8, 9, 10 years old, I guess, maybe even before that, all wearing Cubs T-shirts and with our little bats and gloves and everything. So I didn't go to that many games growing up. The eldest of we had 9 kids in our family. 2 adults make 11, and there was always things going on. But I went to a few games here and there, and then when my sisters were in high school, they would go to games, and it was so easy to get to. You'd hop on the train and then go into the ballpark, and what was it, $3, $4 for a ticket? And my sister Jane was telling me just a while ago, they'd go down and there was hardly anybody in the ballpark, so the players would all be there and they'd be signing balls and bats and things like that. So it was just a kind of a neat way to spend an afternoon. And everything. So that's how I got involved. I followed them, casually, but I was never really a strong fan. But of all the baseball teams, that was my favorite. But I was not a rabid follower until really just in the last few years or so. I'm a librarian by occupation, but I'm a writer by avocation, and I've written quite a few articles and some essays and books, mostly of a literary nature. And after my last big project, I was thinking about branching off into something entirely new, something that was more a lot different from my previous works of literary research and biography. And as I said, I grew up outside of Chicago, and I followed the Cubs here and there. And I thought, the Cubs would be a neat topic. I'm interested in them, and so of course I'd have some sort of affection for them. It'd be fun to do, and I'd really be interested in it, which is always what I want to write about. And also, I always want to write about something that had never been done before. And of course, I must own over 200 books on the Cubs, but I just wanted to find an angle that hadn't been done before. So, and then I discovered the 19th century Cubs really hadn't been done much. There's maybe 2, 3 books at the most that cover those, and none of them have really strong documentation. And I'm really big on, as you can see by looking at my book, I'm big on footnotes and citations. But anyway, in the summer of 2004, I was reading the Cubs magazine called Byline, and a fan wrote a letter to the editor in which he said he'd been having this heated argument with a friend of his who had the audacity to say that the Cubs had not always played at Wrigley Field, and the fan said, well, the Cubs have always been at Wrigley Field, the hallowed grounds of Wrigley Field, and going on and on about how wonderful Wrigley Field is. And he asked Byline to set the record straight and tell him, that so I could tell my friend the Cubs have always been at Wrigley Field. And so Byline did, and explained that the Cubs have, until 2016, the Cubs have never won a World Series at Wrigley Field, and that they played at a number of ballparks on the south side or the west side before settling down in 1916 at what was then Weeghman Park, named after Charles Weeghman, the owner, and which was renamed Cubs Park in 1919, and Wrigley Field in 1926. And that's what gave me the idea. Well, I had a little idea before, but that's what really clued it in. Hey, this is something I can maybe try to really make a mark on, cover the 19th century Cubs, how they got started, what led to the formation of the Cubs, what went on. I knew they won some championships back then, but really focus on an era that I think has been really neglected. I love George Wool's book called what's called A Nice Little Place on the North Side. Well, the Cubs had a nice little place on the west side too, and the south side. But those are kind of footnotes in Cubs lore, and I really wanted to bring that out.
This also sounds a little dangerous, right? Because if you're a librarian by vocation, right, this could be a very dangerous enterprise, right? Because you could easily get, and I love to get sort of some of the process of how once you decided you wanted to do this, that you could probably get caught up in the numerous rabbit holes, right, of discovery, and I want to say enjoy, but revel and or unearth a relatively unending Pandora's box of discoveries and never get to the writing part, right? So how did you go about doing this?
That's exactly right, Tim. And there were times when I thought to myself, what in the heck have I done with my life here? Because at times I thought I bit off more than I could chew. And the Cubs historian, we've never met, but we've become good friends. And there's another researcher out of Minneapolis who's written quite a bit on the Cubs. The two of them really encouraged me to stay at it. Yeah, it's worth it. But there are, as I said, I have hundreds of books on the Cubs, and I started reading them. And I said, oh my God, this never ending. And so I wanted to get a flavor, because I was going into this cold. I didn't know that much about the Cubs. It was just the basics. And of course, there are some people who think that the Cubs began in 1969, with that World Series. It wasn't. But so then I got a good idea of what was going on just by reading the secondary sources. And then I discovered some of the great websites out there, Retro Sheet, Baseball Reference, and I joined SABR, the Society for American Baseball Research, and all their great resources. And they've got some things that are available online to SABR, like the Sporting News newspaper and some other ones. And that was just really a godsend, having some of these online sources. I discovered a sporting newspaper, the New York Clipper, put out by, it's maintained in digital form by the University of Illinois. So that was a godsend, having these top-notch sporting publications available online, and the optical character recognition was pretty good too. So I started, getting some of the main websites and some of the historical material, which some of it's in my bibliography in the back of the book, like the Al Spalding's history. They're just a marvelous source, and a lot of them have been reissued in facsimile editions. And I got those on book collecting websites and on eBay. I got a real nice set of those, and some of them are even online too. So Cap Anson's autobiography, Albert Spalding's autobiography, and so I just started doing research. And finally, I remember I have a note to my twin brother saying, "Hey, it's July 31st, 2004. I wrote the very first paragraph of chapter 1. But there were times, Tim, when I guess I got going on this maybe 1997, 1998, and I didn't start writing until about 2004. And even then there was more problems because I have access as a librarian to a lot of databases, but some of the newspapers, some of these Chicago newspapers I wanted to use that I come across in my research just aren't available online. And so I would get reels upon reels of microfilm, like from the Chicago Evening Journal and the Chicago Inner Ocean and the Chicago Times and some of these other ones. I'd just camp out in our library, like on the weekends when we were closed, on Sunday mornings, and all through Christmas break. I spent so many Christmas vacations just, camped out over microfilm. And one of my colleagues came in when I wasn't there, and I saw my little cassette, my CD player, my slippers, and my robe, and some snacks and bottles of water, all by the microfilm readers. And she still recounts that story. That Jack has set up shop in the library over Christmas vacation. But my sweater, water bottle, and everything. And, of course, their support and interest have really helped me keep me going. But, yeah, it was just – and I kept getting sidetracked, as you said, by these great stories, with the way the sports writers would write it back that time and their flowery language. Eugene Field, for example, is a sports writer for the old Chicago Daily News, the afternoon edition. So I had to that was very hard to get the Chicago Daily News, the afternoon edition, through microfilm, because not too many libraries had it, but we had a wonderful interlibrary loan a librarian who really just went all out to make sure I got what I needed. But he was well known for Winkin', Blinkin', and Nod and Little Boy Blue, but he was also a sports writer, and he was really famous for some of this flowery language that he would write. He'd write his columns with. And all. So it was a lot of fun, and the whole campus finally knew about it sometime after a while. I get students stopping me on the campus walk saying, "Hey, you're the Cubs guy. When's your book going to get done?" So it just all took a life on its own. I just had a really good time doing it. I discovered some neat things that were never really known before. For example, I was going through the Chicago Evening Post. Page by page. I don't think that was available online. And I just, especially in 1893 when the West Side grounds was built. And I came across, I flipped over on the microfilm, and there was this marvelous drawing of the old West Side grounds, and so I had a nice laser copy made of that, and I have it in the book, and as well as their clubhouse and some other things. I spent a whole weekend trying to discover when and why the club left the South Side Park. This was after the Players League for the West Side grounds, and I found out. And again, I really literally did spend a whole weekend, and I trying to figure this out. Because I said I have a chronology at the beginning of the book that kind of maps out their whole history from about the Civil War time up to about 1902 when they became the Cubs, and I discovered that the president at that time, Jim Hart, who succeeded Albert Spalding, he leased the South Side Park to the promoters of a World's Fair college baseball tournament. And so he moved all of the team's games to the West Side grounds for the remainder of the season. And I remember the Cubs historian told me, God, Jack, that's a great find. I've always wanted to find that information too. And I just kept on going to databases, going through microfilm. And again, after an entire weekend, I finally found it. Just made my day, Tim. That's one thing I really, really wanted to find. And I've noticed sometimes researchers, and this is true of all fields, I guess, they repeat the same story sometimes, and sometimes they aren't really true. Like I can think of 2 or 3 books, Cubs histories, that repeat. After the Chicago team lost a real crucial game, about at least 3 sources say that the Chicago Tribune printed an editorial that says Chicago needs a representative club, an organization as great as their enterprise and wealth, one that will not allow the second-rate clubs of every village in the Northwest to carry away all the honors in baseball contests. And I didn't want to just cite unseen, even though they gave the date, but I couldn't find it in the Tribune. And I got to the Tribune on microfilm. I couldn't find it on the Tribune database. And so my twin brother and I were in Chicago. We went to the Chicago Public Library. We started checking newspapers. Couldn't find it there. And then I asked a friend who's written quite a few books on the Cubs, and he knew right away what newspaper it would probably be in, the Chicago Times. He went to the Chicago Public Library himself and found the article on that day and copied it and sent it to me. So that was a real find too. I spent hours and hours trying to verify that article. I didn't want to have any secondary research that I didn't know about was actually true in the book.
It almost seems like a search for a holy grail, so to speak, or maybe multiple ones. Let's reel it back a little, because the smart aleck Cub fan out there, right, will probably say, oh, of course, they started as the Chicago White Stockings, which is obviously interesting to White Sox fans of the current generation, right? But most people probably will say, those smart alecks will probably say, oh yeah, it was back when the National League was begun in 1876 and they were a charter franchise. But before that, though, right, the Cubs story actually begins much earlier than that. And maybe you can give us a little bit of a synopsis of how it kind of gets going in the National Association, even before that, given the Cincinnati Reds and their, pre-professionalizing, I guess, of the sport altogether.
Now, Chicago really liked its baseball, okay? There were like a handful of teams before the Civil War, but in 1866, I think after the Civil War, the city had about 30 semi-professional teams, strong amateur teams. Then the Civil War had been tough, and even people wanted some enjoyment. Even the Chicago Tribune had a big editorial about how, let's go to the games, let's play baseball, let's have a good time. And they were really looking forward to the game that started it all. It took place on July 21st, 1868, between a real strong Chicago Excelsiors, which was one of the strongest teams in the Midwest, and the Cincinnati Buckeyes. And like 10,000 people had gathered to watch the Excelsiors play. And again, it was one of the best teams in the Midwest. In 1867, they had won 10 games and lost only 1. And in that game, the Chicago Excelsiors lost to the Cincinnati Buckeyes, 43-22. In fact, that's what inspired that quotation I read, that what Chicago needs is a good club. And so people were really embarrassed, and they were really embarrassed because at that time, the Cincinnati Red Stockings was getting all the recognition around the country. They were founded in 1866. They were the team around the country. In 1869, I think it won all 57 of its games. And anyway, they wanted to get a piece of the recognition here. And so a group of businessmen met together in October 1869, and they met to form a professional club, and the word went out. We want to get a club going, and they had advertisements in some of the leading sporting publications, and they signed. In fact, my hero, so to speak, is a guy named Jimmy Wood. They talk about Ernie Banks being Mr. Cub. Well, in my idea of Mr. Cub is Jimmy Wood, although I guess you'd say he was Mr. Whitestocking. But he was the very first player signed. Most players back then got about $1,500. He got about $2,000, and that was how the team came about. And he himself went, and a man named Tom Foley, who was one of the father of American billiards, by the way, he went to various places out east recruiting teams, and they eventually signed a good team. And then April 29th, 1870, they went to play one of their first games in St. Louis, the St. Louis Unions, and they had white stockings, and supposedly, and of course this is undoubtedly, well, I shouldn't say undoubtedly, but it could be apocryphal, but in one of the articles that I had, a boy exclaimed, "Oh, look at the white stockings," and that name stuck, and that's how they became known as the White Stockings. And by the way, they won that game 47-1. So that's how it all started.
But that's all though before even anything quote unquote organized, right? This is really kind of really formative stuff, right? We're not even at the
Right. Let me get into that. The whole sport was changing at that time too. The administrative body at that time, in pre-60s, was pre-60s and in the mid-60s, was called the National Association of Baseball Players. That had been organized in 1858, and it included a lot of amateur teams and maybe about a dozen or so professional teams. The amateurs played for fun, the professionals played for money. And these salary teams were growing in popularity. They had the best players, so of course they could generate the highest interest and they could generate the large ticket sales. Unfortunately, though, there were a lot of problems, Tim, going on at this time, and that's what part of the fun and some of my research was. Some of the stories, in fact, even including the White Stockings, involving the gambling going on at that time, the throwing of games called hippodroming. Thank God for Paul Dixon's baseball dictionary, because all these names I'd never heard about before. Hippodroming was the throwing of games. Revolvers, the name revolvers refers to people who broke their contracts by jumping from one team to another. The one that offered the most money, they would go to them. Alcohol drinking, or the White Stockings had its share of those later on. Game scheduling was haphazard at best, which made playing for the championships difficult. Some teams would form and play a few home games. They'd earn some money. Then they disband when they had to go travel, and that would cost money. So in March 1871, the White Stockings, I think it was 9 other professional teams, they gathered in New York City, and they formed what's called the National Association of Professional Baseball Players, and soon to be called the National Association. So they discussed rules, they'd charge an entry fee, each team would play the best 3 out of 5 games, and they had relatively few clubs, and they had to play a lot of exhibition games, of course, against amateur clubs to make any money. But still, they were still gambling. They were still throwing of the ball games, the hippodroming, and this was a largely player-run organization, had no central leadership, simply not up to the task. And so the game fixing really kept people away. The alcoholism, the rowdiness on the part of the players as well as the fans. Also, the Cincinnati Red Stockings I talked about, they were so good, and Al Spalding mentions this in his autobiography, that their winning discouraged other clubs. Why should we get a team together? The Red Stockings are going to win. And the small teams from the small cities lacked the financial backing of the large city teams. The mediocre teams didn't attract large crowds, so of course they took in little money. They were still the revolvers. And the example, the thing that really started, William Hulbert is kind of like Mr. White Stocking back in that area too, in terms of the administration. In fact, he was largely unrecognized. I think he finally got elected to the Hall of Fame in maybe the mid 1990s. But anyway, he started the whole
1995. But he's very much a seminal figure in all of this. William Hulbert.
Yeah, he's a seminal figure. Okay, and he was a secretary of the Chicago club at that time, which is called the Chicago Baseball Club. But anyway, a man named Davy Force, I can't remember his position, but the famous example though, he renewed his Chicago contract, but then he signed with Philadelphia, the Philadelphia Athletics, and so this of course ticked off William Hulbert, and the National Association had a judiciary committee. And he ruled in favor of Chicago. Well, no, you're a revolver here. You sign with Chicago, you keep it. But then at a baseball conference, there was a newly elected committee, and he sided with Philadelphia, and said, okay, no, they did not sign their contract. Chicago didn't sign the contract correctly. You can go to Philadelphia, and this really incensed William Hulbert, and he saw point blank then how the wealthy teams in the East, he had a big thing about the teams in the East, Philadelphia, New York, some other ones, with his powerful, his influential managers, they control the whole league, and he started thinking about how he could change things. And so one of the first things he did in 1875, he lured pitcher Al Spalding from the Boston team, was one of the best teams at that time. And Al Spalding was there, and the Big Four, which was second baseman Ross Barnes, catcher James Deacon White. By the way, he mentioned Aurora, Illinois. That's where he died in Aurora, Illinois, and he finally made it to the Hall of Fame just a couple of years ago. And infielder Cal McVeigh, also infielder Adrian Anson from the Philadelphia Athletics. So he hired all them, and that's what really got his team going. And later on, he noticed that the Western teams financially supported the Eastern teams. Chicago being one of the Western teams at that time. The West was part of the Midwest. The St. Louis Brown Stockings, the Louisville Grays, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, they called them the Western teams. And he realized that a lot of these teams, when they played, they garnered so much more money in ticket sales. But when these Western teams went out east, fewer people would go to the games, and so they weren't making as much money. And so he and the Western teams met in late 1875. And then later on, they invited the Eastern teams to meet in early February 1876, and they formed the National League. They had an entry fee of $100. No club could be admitted to the National League from a city of fewer than 75,000 people. No club from the same city as a member club or within 5 miles could join, because he said they could see how money was being siphoned off from some of these teams that had two teams in the same city, and that's what started the whole National League. Oh, I mentioned the gambling. On 1875, a real famous example, the White Stockings were playing the Philadelphia Pearls in 1875, and both sides were charged with 21 errors, 11 in Philadelphia and 10 in Chicago. And then the Chicago Tribune, revealed what happened. They learned the Philadelphia Pearls had been paid by gamblers to throw the game, and Chicago players were upset that they weren't included in the deal, so they started to lose the game. And so both teams were trying to lose the game, and none was succeeding, and that's why all these errors came up. And people in Chicago were really, really upset, and all these editorials were written about how the baseball was being ruined, and something had to be done. And Forrest and Stream said something like, the National Association is an organization that can be run in the interest of either the honest or the knavish class of the professional players of the country.
Yeah, that's interesting. We got into that a little bit with our previous guest, Bill Reisick, who wrote about the National Association. And yeah, it's funny to sort of, I guess, through the lens of history, sort of recognize that, this idea of professionalism was actually initially greeted with derision and fear because of it polluting, if you will, the sanctity of the sport. But, arguably the National Association really was kind of the gelling, if you will, from that pure play amateur kind of thing into what ultimately became the first professional league with the National League.
Funny you mentioned gelling, because one sports writer when the White Stockings were really getting going, and I was interested, and that the sports writers were really, even the Chicago ones who wanted the team to succeed. Boy, they had no holds barred. When Chicago was screwing up, or when they thought Chicago was screwing up, they would let them have it. And I thought that was really interesting too. When they were getting going and they weren't signing the players, I remember the Chicago Tribune said, and Chicago Tribune had a sports writer named Lewis Meacham, who was kind of William Hulbert's mouthpiece. In fact, the Chicago Tribune published what baseball needs to be done to succeed. So I think late in November 1875, and I think it was Lewis Meacham probably wrote that with Hulbert. But he said in the Tribune that 3 months after the team was organized, the famous Chicago Nine, which was supposed to have been beaten, the Cincinnati Red Stockings in particular, and the world in general, consists of 2 players. These bunglers allowed the days and the weeks to slip by, doing things that they ought not to have done and leaving undone many things that they have done. And talked about how it was all fizzled and everything, and they called them baseball hacks.
Yeah, so I was going to get. So you wanted to sort of throw this in there. So because we're talking about sort of this period of time, the National Association, this is a period roughly between 1871 and 1875. But it's also interesting. I don't even call it an asterisk in this story, but 1871, right, is clearly a date that most Chicagoans know just through rote memory and having sort of learned about Chicago history. An inauspicious event happens near the end of the first season.
Okay, they were playing pretty well in 1870. They played real well. They beat the almighty White Stockings and everything else. And so they didn't have that much money in their treasury, as I recall. But they had enough to get going, and their board of directors said, well, yeah, we're going to have another season here and everything. And so in September and October 1871, they were tied, as I recall, with the Philadelphia Athletics, with the best record in the National Association. I think it was like 18 victories and 7 losses, and they were going to be playing the Athletics on October 17th, 1871. Yeah, but unfortunately, though, they never made it to the train station. The Chicago fire, of course, on October 8, 1871, it incinerated about, I think, 3 1/3 square miles of the heart of the city, including the White Stocking Stadium and its grounds, and the homes and possessions, of most of the players. I think Tom Foley, the business manager, lived not outside that area, and I think it might have been Jimmy Wood. I can't remember. I think Jimmy Wood. They were the only ones not affected, and of course, it was too bad. One, of course. The city, I have a quotation in the book that says that 3 or 4 days ago, the White Stockings were on everybody's mind. Now on October 9th, they're on nobody's mind. They've got other things to worry about here. There's absolutely no public attention given to them whatsoever. I think I said something like it maybe said that they occupied very much inferior positions in the attention of the people. And so they didn't have anything going for them. They had little money. They had the clothes on their backs practically. And so they really wanted to get a little bit of income here. And so again, good old Jimmy Wood, he contacted the New York Clipper, and the New York Clipper put out some ads in his publication saying, please support the baseball players, get some exhibition games. They're out of the championship now. They because they missed their game with Philadelphia, and they couldn't make that up at the time. They wanted to get some exhibition games going to earn a little bit of money. They didn't have any uniforms, so they were playing in borrowed uniforms. Somebody would have a uniform top from some team, a uniform bottom from another team. A real motley assortment of uniforms from other teams. And so I think on October 12th, they played against the Troy Haymakers in Troy, New York. They won that game, lost another one. In fact, even though they were playing in New York, the spectators were largely sympathetic to the Chicago team because they could see, these people were destitute. Fortunately, the train companies gave them free railroad passes, so they were able to fly. They were able to take the train out there. But they still, of course, had to live and they had to get by. Then they ran into rain, and so they had to cancel more games. So they finally managed to limp home. And the Chicago Tribune commented that, this is going to be a season, the year 1872 will be a season of work and no baseball whatsoever. The Chicago Baseball Club surrendered its stock and had about $2,000 in the treasury, but there would be no team in 1872. But they did manage to, play some exhibition games, limp home, and they started trying to regroup for the next year. And in fact, towards that end, the Chicago Baseball Club reorganized, and they built a park in order to attract people to play games there, maybe take in some money, and then maybe start another team at the same time. And that's what they did. They reorganized itself as the Chicago Baseball Association, and they got some land on the south side of Chicago on 23rd Street and Burnside Street, later Dearborn, and near 22nd Street, which is now Cermak Road, and they built a park there.
And in the years and the year and a half that followed, then Hulbert worked basically behind the scenes to really help create this National League. So in many respects, not only Hulbert was sort of the author, if you will, of this White Stockings franchise through thick and thin, right? He was also the guy really behind putting the crowning touch on the National League altogether.
Yeah, he did. He did there, and he was elected president of the National League shortly after it was founded, and he was president of the Chicago Baseball Association in the fall of 1875. It was even before the National League. He was president of the Chicago Baseball Association, and he was made president of the National League in their first big meeting after they were formed. This was in December of 1876 they met, and he was elected president. So he was president of both offices until his death on April 10th, 1882. And they recognized him when he died with all sorts of honors, and he was inducted in the National Baseball Hall of Fame in 1995. Because he really was, as you said, Tim, a real seminal figure. If it weren't for William Hulbert, he's probably next on my line of heroes after Jimmy Wood.
All right, a brief pause in the proceedings just for a second to pay a couple of bills, and we appreciate your giving our sponsors some consideration as always. And one of our earliest ones that continues to be with us and we love is our friends at Audible. And Audible is, as you know, the king of audiobooks. And if you've never tried an audiobook for yourself, well, here's a great opportunity to do so and to support the show at the same time. And that's when you go to audibletrial.com/goodseats. That's the place to go, and you're going to get a free audiobook download for yourself to try for free, gratis, on us. You can cancel the Audible service at any time, and once you do download that book, and if you do decide to cancel it, it's yours to keep. So that's our little free gift, and even if you don't continue with the Audible service going forward, you'll at least get a free audiobook out of the deal. And look, if you consider yourself somebody who's interested in sports and sports history and that kind of stuff, like we try to pursue on this little podcast, you're going to find a whole bunch of titles in the vast array of, 190,000 and counting titles to choose from. And in particular, if you like the hoops, the basketball, well, sure, we got a couple of those books, including, of course, probably the quintessential tome, oral history, if you will, of the ABA, the American Basketball Association. That's called Loose Balls, and Terry Pluto is the writer and I believe the narrator of that book as well. That you could use your credit for that, and it's a wonderful romp, that book, and a great oral history of perhaps the most colorful basketball league of all time, the ABA. Or if you're really interested, let's say, in the National Basketball Association's history, you could check out the audiobook from our previous guest, David Surdam, who we had a great chat about the history of the NFL. But this book is called The Rise of the National Basketball Association, and David wrote it. It's narrated by Todd Bars-Ness. You say that 3 times fast. And a lot of the interesting stuff in this book talks about the NBA in the context of congressional hearings around antitrust and that kind of stuff around the 40s and 1950s. Fascinating stuff. And you can use your credit for that book too, among, like I said, 190,000+ other titles to choose from at Audible. And again, it's audibletrial.com/goodseats. And you're going to get, again, your free audiobook download courtesy of us You can cancel at any time. It is yours to keep, and we appreciate you giving them a try, and we certainly appreciate you rejoining our conversation right now. So talk about that those first couple of years then as the National League. The team is still actually known as the Chicago White Stockings, and they're playing at the 23rd Street grounds. So interesting that Hulbert's sort of holding both of these jobs, which is interesting, and you wonder about the conflict there. But it seems to me that he was quite brilliant, Hulbert was, in attracting a few star players. You've mentioned, I think both of them, frankly, were two of the major ones, Albert Spalding, who we should talk about, as well as a first baseman by the name of Adrian Anson, who ultimately winds up being known as Cap. Both of them Hall of Famers, and for different but important reasons.
Yeah. Cap Anson, he later fell on hard times. Like he was run out of town, or no, what? Not really run out of town on a rail, but people really got tired of Cap Anson, and for good reason. He stayed on too long, but he joined the White Stockings in 1876. William Hubbard brought him over in 1875, and he captained the team from 1879 to 1897. So think of all those years he was there, and he hit. He batted for 300 every year except for a few years in the end there. And in fact, I think when he died, Sporting Life said, as a consistent batsman, no one has ever equaled Cap Anson. But few people could generate the cheers and the jeers as much as Anson did. Sporting Life called him the greatest batsman ever produced, but as a field captain, he had few equals and no superior. But his team, the team members, really, really disliked him, and he brooked no interference. He would hold them accountable at all times. He'd just run them into the ground practicing. Johnny Evers, the great Johnny Evers of Tinker to Evers to Chance. He said that in his autobiography, that training under him was a nightmare. And everything. And then later, of course, a lot of people recognize that a lot of people think that he kept African Americans out of baseball for a long time, and I address this in my book. And in 1883, the White Stockings were supposed to play an exhibition game against a minor league team in Toledo, Ohio, the Toledo Blue Stockings. I think they were in their first year of in the Northwestern minor league, and a really good, top-notch player was named by name of Moses Fleetwood Walker, otherwise known as Fleetwood Walker. And he had played baseball at Oberlin College, at the University of Michigan. He was a law student in Ann Arbor, and he was a catcher. But he was African American, as I said, and he had a sore hand and was not going to play anyway. But when Anson saw him, he told the team, said that they would not play with Fleet Walker in the lineup, and so he put himself in the lineup, and then played right field. And the team, to their credit, put Fleet Walker in the lineup, and he played right field. He couldn't play catcher because of his sore hand. And Chicago won, but it was close, and the score was 7-6. And the Toledo Daily Blade, and I reprint this in my book, I reprinted some of the more significant primary sources, called Anson the beefy bluffer, they called him. And they also called him Baby Anson, because, in fact, he was called Baby Anson a lot during his career because he pouted all the time. Another verb that was common in the sporting columns back then was kicking. When you argue with the umpire, you're kicking, and they always said he was kicking, or they called him Baby Anson for complaining to the umpires a lot too. But anyway, they talk about the Toledo Daily Blade talked about what a gentleman Fleet Walker was, and how the White Stockings were not gentlemen. Their uniforms were dirty, and they really came out on favor of Fleet Walker. And I have some baseball histories that say, they say that Cap Anson is an outspoken proponent of a baseball color line. He single-handedly kept African Americans out of professional baseball, and I wondered about that. And again, I come across some articles or some websites, and I can't remember the name of the book. I was talking to the Cubs historian about this, Ed Hartig, who helped me a great deal, and I think I quote from him in my book about this. And we were both talking that while Anson was a superb player, he was a magnificent player, but he was a jerk. He had a combative personality, he had a prickly disposition, and he was arrogant. He was boastful. He was arrogant all through his career, and that endeared him to few people. So Ed and I were talking about this, and we reasoned that if baseball officials really were kind of thinking about breaking the color line, would they be willing to go along with someone whom they intensely dislike so much? And we both thought that, well, if they wanted to break the color line, they probably would, if only to get back at Anson. And the fact that they didn't, that means that maybe perhaps Anson's views pretty much shared throughout the game at that particular time.
Yeah, that's very interesting because, and frankly, quite, surprising and controversial, right? Because I think you kind of encapsulated. He's a guy that's obviously a good player, but certainly not without, shall we say, a lack of confidence and maybe even in his convictions. Now I also have to wonder, and I wonder if you got into this a little bit. I mean, it's a guy who was elected into the Hall of Fame in 1939, right? So not a hugely long period of time since his passing. But for something that is so, I don't know, morally and politically and otherwise charged as this idea of segregation, right? When that, I think it's a very interesting and perhaps unseemly part of the now Cubs history that I think many people don't sort of realize. And you just wonder how he, I don't want to say gets away with all of this, but how do you juxtapose, his playing and arguably his appeal for this team? Because hell, the name of the team even changes, I think, because of him. But yet all this sort of, shall we say, borderline ugliness associated with his personality as well. I don't understand how all that sort of, how do you change the name of the team, if you will, or the sports writers and stuff? Is it just simply force of personality despite its goodness or badness? Or how do you, it's curiosity to me.
I think it was the force of his personality, because he was, for better or for worse, he really was larger than life. I'd see cartoons in the paper, and toward he was forced to retire in 1897, and prior to that time, they call him Uncle Ans, they call him Baby Anson. They had all these names. They call him Grandpa, and during one game, I know that he decided if they're going to call him Grandpa, he would play up to this, and so he went up to bat wearing a set of false whiskers that went down to his knees, and he swore to the umpire that if that ball hit his beard, he would claim his base. But I think the paper says something like, nothing disturbed Uncle Anson's beard except for the whispering breezes off the lake, or something like that. But
well, did nobody kind of want to challenge him? Was that it?
No, I never saw. At least in what I saw. Ken, maybe they did challenge it, but I go through these newspapers page by page for quite a few years, and I never really saw him challenge. They challenged his playing ability. Because he was really going downhill toward his later years, and they'd call him all sorts of names. They'd say, "Grandpa, your pants are not your pants are falling down, but you got baggy pants, and go home, Grandpa," and things like that. But they did not challenge him on that issue, which makes me think that the views were largely held throughout that era. Now I haven't done any real extensive research on that issue by itself, but I know in what I've read that weren't any. In fact, later on there was another game in which in the 1890 something or other, they were going to play another team. And on that team, they backed down. They did not play their black players. Now I can't remember offhand the name of the team, but It was a minor league team at that time up in New York State.
I got to think too that Anson, and frankly, he wasn't the only player on the team, right? But he was clearly let's put it this way, he was stirring the drink of a team that was doing quite well. They were winning a lot of pennants, right, in that time. And I guess my question would be, circa 1889, 1890, how and why does the name kind of officially or semi-officially or just colloquially become the Colts? Where's the Colts come from?
Okay, they were called the White Stockings for a while, and then in '89, and that's a whole other topic. They had the Players League, which was a whole another league at that time, and that siphoned off a lot of the good players, and players at that time were offered contracts that did not include a reserve clause and everything. So a lot of players wanted to play for the Players League, and so sports writers called the team the Colts because these were young players hired to replace the men who left for the Players League. And Tim, this is something else I wanted to comment on, and that's something I did not know until I started the research, and that the sports writers were the ones who got the names. They were the ones who coined the names, and I was going crazy before I finally realized this. I go to these secondary sources, and they would have these years broken down neatly for when they were called the White Stockings first, and then the Colts, and then other names came about, and it all varied from year to year. Some books said, Colts were in 1890, some in 1891. So, well, what is it? Then I realized that there really was no hard and fast rule. In fact, sometimes, like Ed Hartig and I were talking about this, the names were changed simply to get another name in there in the sports articles, like the Cubs would be called the Small Bears and everything. And I saw Colts and White Stockings, and they wore black stockings for a while, so they were called Black Stockings. I see 3 or 4 different names in the same articles. But yeah, and I use the names that they're on the retro sheet database. It's kind of my authority file. But all sorts of these young players were being hired to replace the old veterans leaping to the Players League, and so sports writers started calling them the Colts. Now, we had a guy named Jim Hart succeeded was Al Spalding as president of the team. He retired in the mid 1890s, I think. Off the top of my head, I'm not sure, but anyway. He sounded out former third baseman Tom Burns, who was manager of a minor league team, to become Anson's replacement. And on January 31st, 1898, when it expired, and so the Colts had no managers, so sports writers started calling them the Orphans. In fact, I have an article from one person who wrote into the Chicago Tribune saying that something to the effect that since the Colts have lost their papa, they should be called the Orphans. And sports writers jumped on this, and so they were called the Orphans for a while until, of course, then they became the Cubs later on in 1902.
That's interesting, too. So there's a bit of colloquialism, and there's a bit of sort of almost slang and inside sort of, but yes, this is not just unique to Chicago, right? And we had another conversation back in late 2017 with Bob Ross on the Players League, which is its own sort of interesting intrigue. But yeah, it's also interesting too because there's some now real competition. Obviously, the Players League, and then you had the American League in 1901. A lot of attention now to this formerly, shall we say, frisky and/or unruly professionalism in baseball. Now is really started to really attract people's business interests. And the Colts/Orphans, soon-to-be Cubs, were no exception as they were kind of maturing.
In fact, my book is called "Before They Were the Cubs," and I wanted to find out, well, when did they exactly become the Cubs? And they were called the Orphans, and the team was, when Tom Burns was not a very good manager, and then they got somebody else who was not a very good manager either, and of course the players themselves were not at all well disciplined, and they were really a hard bunch to manage. And so Jim Hart hired a man named Frank Seeley, who spent 12 years managing the Boston Bean Eaters, which had taken home about 5 pennants, I think. And so the Chicago Sun-Times just a few years ago I think it might have been in 2016 when the Cubs won the pennant. And I did not know this at all. But anyway, a guy named Fred Hayner. He was a sports writer for the old Chicago Daily News, and he felt that the word orphans was way too long to put in the headline, and he wanted a name that would reflect Sealy's rebuilding plan and the whole manager's emphasis on youth. And so in the opening sentence of an unsigned article in the March 27th, 1902 Chicago Daily News, he observed that, quote, Frank Sealy would devote his strongest efforts on the teamwork of the new Cubs this year. And the Daily News editor at that time, James Gilruth, he wrote an article I came across years later that the name change was a result of a discussion with him and this guy, Fred Hayner, and also the Daily News assistant sports editor, Charles Sensenbaugh. And they mentioned that Hayner objected to orphans, so they all came in together and they all started tossing names about. And and according to Gilruth, one of them, I don't recall who, came up with the name Cubs, and Cubs it was, and Cubs it is even today. But, as I said, the sports writers chose a name, and it took a while for that name to get to stick too. It wasn't until the late, I think, 1906 when it really got adapted, because they were still calling them the White Stockings, and they had all sorts of other names. They were called the Remnants for a while because some of the players jumped to the American League, so they called them the Remnants. They played out west for a while. They were called the Rough Riders, and they're called Sealyites for Frank Sealy for a while. So there were all sorts of names. So, but finally the Cubs. I think Ed Hartig told me that Frank Chance of Tinker Divers to Chance, he really liked the name Cubs, and so I think it kind of solidified back in 1906. I think it was 1906, and then formally adopted a little later on than that too.
So was Al Spalding, who obviously went on to, the name is obviously not by chance, because it's the Sporting Goods name is very much affixed to him. He gave up ownership of the club when he gave it up to John Hart in 1902. Was there any correlation, I guess, to this sort of evolving name change, or was that just sort of coincidence that was happening?
I think it was just coincidence. Yeah, I think it was just coincidence. Well, when the Colt came about, it wasn't purely by chance, because Anson had been pretty much forced out by Jim Hart, and Jim Hart had another sports writer friend, and fans wanted Hart out too. He had been worn out his welcome. In that book, there's a cartoon of Hart reaching for Anson reaching for the pennant and trying to grab it, and so since he was out and they were without their manager, and that's how the name, Orphans came about too. So Spalding was pretty much in the background by that time. When he was still part of the team, he was a major stockholder, but he was pretty much behind the scenes at that time. At least I didn't find much of him in there. I know I addressed this a little bit, and maybe it might have been in a note that Anson himself thought Spalding had treated him rather poorly. Well, because Anson wanted to become manager of the whole club, but Spalding overlooked him in favor of Jim Hart, who had helped Spalding with his big world tour. But Anson in his book says that that Hart was a lousy manager, not much good as a human being himself, and they just liked each other all the time. Anson felt that Hart undermined him. Anson would fine players, and Hart would resend the fine. So the two of them intensely disliked each other. And Anson, in his autobiography, felt that Spalding really kind of sold him down the river, so to speak.
Yeah, but Spalding was certainly, as you hinted at, but before, on his way out, right? Arguably, sort of made one of the most signature moves in not even Cubs yet history, although arguably that's around the time the Cubs name was starting to catch. Why don't you just briefly explain for those people who are not diehard Cubs fan and don't even know these names? Joe Tinker, Johnny Evers, and Frank Chance. These were guys that not only Hall of Famers, but constituted what became a fairly strong and dominant team. That was largely Spalding's doing, no?
Yes, it was. I think I can't remember. I think Evers came first. He was hired as an infielder. I think Frank Chance was catcher, but then later he moved to first base, and then Joe Tinker was at third base, or excuse me, shortstop, and so that was largely during Spalding's watch in the 1890s here. Yeah, that was all Spalding's doing, and I don't think they realized at the time just how good they would be, and everything. But and they later became famous because of that poem that Franklin P. Adams wrote called "Tinker to Everest a Chance to Use a Strongest of Strangest of Possible Words, Tinker to Everest a Chance." But they didn't really turn that many double plays from Joe Tinker, shortstop, to Evers at second base, and to Frank Chance at first base. But that doggerel, that little poem, I think really brought them into the Hall of Fame, largely on that string. Of course, they were good players anyway. They were really good players anyway, and that team back in 1908, 1907, that was and I think their win-loss record in 1906. I think they won 116 games. That's no one will ever beat that. I don't think.
Well, so let me ask you a research/history question, right? Because obviously, again, you're a librarian by trade, and research and obviously meticulous footnotes. I saw the word meticulous a couple of times in the book reviews I read, which is good. I think that's more than a compliment. When we're talking about these names and you're talking about how loosely applied they were, depending on maybe the newspaper or the sports writer that you were reading, or perhaps the time of the season or the year or where they were on the schedule, whatever. Seems like there was very liberal usage of different names and stuff. But I'm sure you have an opinion, I guess, and being a SABR member as well, I'm sure there are whole committees and consortia devoted to this topic. Where did the lines of demarcation happen when shall we say, the history books are written, and or an agreement is made that in 1902 or 1903's season is when officially the Cubs were recognized as the Cubs? When you've alluded to that. The first time it was actually used was actually maybe a year earlier. Where do these boundaries, orphans, cults, White Stockies, where did the, based on your knowledge of this particular topic around Chicago, the team in Chicago, where do these lines get drawn, and how are they drawn? Or is it always full of conjecture, and it just depends on which symposium you're going to determine, what's what, and people are constantly revisiting it?
Well, I think that's exactly correct. I think it's always changing. It's always in flux, and it depends upon what book you're reading. I think on the Hall of Fame's website, or maybe it's in a Hall of Fame book, they give completely different years for the team names than what I gave, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure this out because they were called so many different names anyway. The Chicagos, the Nationals, the Seedlings, the Sprouts, the Microbes, and everything. And so I mentioned, I think in my introduction, I tried to cover all things that people might criticize, and I had to pick one source, and so I used Retrosheet a lot because of its because even the box scores sometimes differed with each other, and I was just going crazy. So I decided to rely upon one source, Retrosheet, for the box scores information as well as for the team names. And there are some that disagree with me, I know, maybe by a year or so. Well, no, the orphans didn't come about until maybe the year after that. I even do searches in databases for a particular year on the Colts for one year and then the orphans for that year and see which ones would come up the most. And finally, I just decided to go with Retrosheet. I had to pick something, and I had to go with that. And the same with box scores. If the newspaper accounts would differ, I used Retrosheet when it came to the box score information as well. But yeah, I'm sure there are some people who would disagree with that. And there are some really good Cubs histories. And one of them I know comes to mind is the one called Cubs Journal by a guy named John Schneider. It's marvelous for year-to-year summaries. And he was the one I know who clued me into the whole idea of the sports writers and changing the names. And I think my choice of names by year might differ with his too. But God knows I went through so many sources trying to figure this whole thing out.
All right. So at what point when you're doing all of this, okay, what point, where's the tipping point when your slippers and you're giving up your third holiday celebration with members of your family. At what point do you kind of say, maybe I've gone too far, or why do I continue to do this? Like, do you do any soul searching as to say, I mean, is it because you've gone too far and you can't go back, or you want to correct history because you think it's important? I mean, what is it that drives you to, probably past exhaustion, to actually continue and meticulously do this?
I really was driven past exhaustion, Tim. There was a point where I kind of like lie awake at night fantasizing, what will it be like to have this done, and when I can kind of have a weekend to myself. Because I go home from work and say, got to work on the book. People at the library say, what are you going to do this weekend? Are you going to go any place? Going to work on the book. Going to work on the book. At that point, I was just driven to it. Because I said I'm a writer by avocation, but there were times when I thought to myself, I really bit off more than I could chew. I mean, there are some people who say, well, everything's on the web. I do all my research on the web. Well, it really isn't. And so going through microfilm, year upon year upon year, all these reels of microfilm, that ain't fun, and everything. And that's what really was a tipping point for me, is how much of this can I go through? Thousands of photocopies and microfilm copies, I should say, in my files. I felt driven to do it because I think this is a topic that's been done before, but I think I can do it and document it. You mentioned my meticulous footnotes. Well, it's never been documented like this before, and I really wanted to I hope give something that will, to use a cliche, stand the test of time. So I look through it, though, I think to myself, I wish a good pitcher was a guy named Jim McCormick. I think he won he in 1886, baby, he won more games than anybody else. Well, maybe I should have mentioned that, a little bit more about Jim McCormick. Or I should have mentioned the Stonewall infield a little bit more. Tom Burns and a couple other people were called the Stonewall infield because no balls get past them. I should have mentioned that. So you can second guess yourself forever. But I know in terms of number of words, I was pretty much past my deadline in terms of number of words. My editor was being very patient. And, of course, then I had gotten sidetracked on some other articles. I had written some journal articles, including one about the ball player who shot Billy Jurgis in 1932. And I thought I want to expand that into a nice little book. And the year of course, Babe Ruth and the call shot. And I'm going to make a case that, this Violet Popovich, by shooting Billy Jurgis, kind of changed the course of baseball history and brought about Babe Ruth and the whole call shot incident. So I spent a lot of time researching that, using some of the Violet's relatives and Billy Jurgis's relatives I talked to, and wrote a real nice article for Saber about that, which won a baseball award, by the way, too. So I really want to expand upon that. But I love this stuff so much. I love the research and the writing. I have to admit, I love the research better than the writing. Writing, I can't remember who said it, something like writing is easy. You just stare at a piece of paper until blood forms on your forehead. Well, and I wrote and I rewrote and rewrote and rewrote, and I was always changing things, and that's just ungodly. I got a picture on my computer of my whole study and what it looked like after I finished a real hard chapter. I started about 8 in the morning, and about 11, 12 o'clock at night, pretty much nonstop, I had finished a chapter, and I was so proud of it and all that.
Well, good writing is hard. There's no doubt about it, especially when it's in form. But you've got to take pride in that, though, because arguably, this is about as comprehensive and as authoritative a work on this period of the team's history. Let me ask you this: have you had any recognition or any interest or any outreach by the current Cubs organization or any serious and or scholarly Cubs fans about your work and it filling in some pieces of things that may not have been known before about this team's history?
Well, that's a good question too, because I really want to promote it as much as I can, and so I send copies to the Cubs organization. I sent a copy to Tom Ricketts. I sent one to Theo Epstein, a personal copy, autographed to each of them. I did not get any replies, I'm afraid. I did get the Cubs historian really liked it a lot, and he's done a great deal of promoting himself, and I think some Chicago newspapers may write about it soon. I sent a copy to Tim Wiles at the Hall of Fame. Well, now he's no longer at the Hall of Fame, but he wrote a few nice comments for the that are on Amazon, and so he was always so helpful. He was the research director at the Hall of Fame, and he helped me a great deal. So, but I've not received many. I've received a lot of individual comments from players. John Thorne at the baseball's Major League Baseball's official historian, he liked it a lot. I sent him a copy. I met him at a baseball conference one time, and we'd emailed here and there. And he likes Jimmy Wood too, Mr. White Stocking. So I sent him a neat article on Jimmy Wood that I found simply by browsing through one of these little known Chicago newspapers, and we've talked about my research. But I really do think it does fill in some gaps, and I hope people will realize that down the road. I hope it'll be picked up by some Chicago blogs too, baseball blogs.
Yeah, I mean, look, if you call yourself a Chicago Cubs fan, and look, I'm a transplant. I come from the New York, New Jersey metropolitan area. I kind of grew up as a Yankees fan, kind of converted to a Mets fan in the 80s when it was, I guess, cool to do that, and whatever. But having married into a lifelong family of Cub fans, and it's been a very interesting journey for me personally, just to kind of see, how people's passions for this team. And it's a borderline illness, let's be honest. But it does go deep and very, I think perhaps more than any other team, I dare say. Maybe the Yankees, but I would even argue that's even a little different. This team has such it's not just a loyal and passionate fan base. I'm sure that every team, maybe with the exception of Miami Marlins fans, would argue that they're, rabid about their team. But the history of this team, it just reeks of it. And I think some of it, obviously is because of the dearth of championships until recently and all that kind of stuff. But I hope that, not only you get on the radar of, the quote unquote true Cub fans, and I know quite a few of them out there who, frankly, this is a blind spot for them. And I think it's also probably a very interesting part of understanding, the primordial ooze, if you will, from which this now very successful and very lucrative franchise came from. Are you going to be in Chicago at all to do some promotion for this book, or what other things are you going to do to help promote it?
Well, that's a good question too. I'm going to be working on this new project, and I've already emailed my brother and sister about getting together in maybe August, because I've got some eye surgery coming up, and I can't go before then. And I thought I would love to do some sort of promotion in August if I could. I don't know really what to do, how I'm going to do it, but maybe contact some bookstores in that area and say, hey, can I set up a book signing here, or promote it any way I can. But I know promotion is largely, and authors have to do a lot of their own promotion themselves. So I would like to do this as much as I can to get up some signings. I had some signings here in Fredericksburg, and it went over real well. I sold a lot of copies. In fact, even students don't have much money, but a lot of students here at the university where I work, they were buying the book. I had about a dozen of them come up to my office and say, "Hey, Mr. Bales, can you sign a copy of your book for me?" And I was very gratified. And I was really gratified by a friend of mine bought it simply because I was her friend. And she kind of looked at it with not disdain, but they said, well, I'm not really a baseball person, but maybe Jack did this, I ought to read it. And she told me later she loved it. And she was quoting passages of it to her family at the dinner table. And it just made my day, this is what I wanted to do, have a real readable history of the Cubs in the area filled with interesting anecdotes. And I was just so touched. I saved a letter, and once in a while I go back and reread it, because she went over in great detail about how much she liked it, liked the sports writers' comments, the way they talked back at that time period too. So yeah, I would love to promote it as much as I could, and I hope it takes off a little bit too.
All righty, there it is. Always learning something new I am each and every week, and Jack Bales, our wonderful guest, helping me fill in all the gaps that I had previously until our chat about the full and earliest of history with the Chicago Cubs that we know and love today. Well, if you're a White Sox fan, you probably don't love them, but a lot of others do And Jack certainly does in particular. The book, again, that he wrote is called Before They Were the Cubs, The Early Years of Chicago's First Professional Baseball Team. It is written by our esteemed guest, Jack Bales, and it is published by our friends at McFarland. Of course, you can find a link to it on our website at goodseatsstillavailable.com. Just search up this episode, number 117. Dear God, I can't believe we put these many episodes out there, but yeah, that's where you'll find it. And just click the link. You'll find yourself whisked away to our friends at Amazon, and you'll give us a few shekels of love by buying the book in that manner, and we appreciate that, of course. If you want to find out more about Jack and his day job as a reference and humanities librarian at the University of Mary Washington, and you will also find a link on his website at jackbales.com. Jack Bales, BALES.com, jackbales.com. You'll find a link to his Chicago Cubs research. He's got a blog there that kind of walks through, I guess, some of the things that he was discovering as he was writing the book. And he fancied himself as the Chicago Cubs-centric historian, of course. And obviously that was evidenced in our chat, but you want to find out more about him, check him out at his website. And again, our website, if you haven't bookmarked it already, shame on you. That's goodseatsstillavailable.com. You want to find all of our old episodes, you'll find them there. You want to find our social media feeds, well, by golly, you'll find those there too. On Facebook, you'll find a page devoted to us. You'll find a link to our profile on Instagram. That's Good Seats Still Available. You want to follow us on Twitter? Well, go ahead and join the hundreds that do that too. And we're at Good Seats Still on Twitter. Let's see. On our website, you'll also find a link to our weekly newsletter. That's our sort of early advance warning signal to let you know what kind of stuff we're going to be talking about the next week. You want to be on the inside of that, and perhaps before the hoi polloi, well, by all means, sign up for that newsletter on our website there. And what else? You can send us email. Of course, you could do that too. We appreciate that. There's a link on our website, a little form you can fill out, or if you just can't be bothered with that, just send it to us directly, why don't you? hello@goodseatsstillavailable.com. Lots of fun stuff coming up soon on that website, so keep checking that early and often. And we also encourage you to check out our friends at Podfly Productions, who help us each week with our production and editorial needs. And of course, you know the good Dr. Jerry Payne is our main man there, and you can find out more about him and them at their website, and that's podfly.net. Okay, we're done for this week. I love the fact that you've listened this long. Here's our obligatory opportunity to yet again play more of Go Cubs Go. So as we segue away, enjoy the late Steve Goodman once again. And we'll look forward to seeing you next week. And until then, the ticket window is now closed.